Uncle Gene's story. Uncle Gene was Dad's oldest brother. He was 17 years older than Dad. He was born 1844 through 45. After the Civil War, he was a young fellow big enough to pass himself off as a veteran. He picked up some cast-off soldiers' uniforms and, as Uncle John told it, strutted himself about like a Yankee colonel. He was quite a reader, and he consumed every report about the war he could find. He memorized the days and dates of battles, the locations of the various units and the fronts, picked up tales true and tall from returning soldiers. There were a lot of 16-year-olds in the army, so mixing it all up with the old soldier's cap and jacket, this brash kid passed himself off as a knowledgeable veteran. He got away with this stunt a few times and then was exposed as a show-off, know-it-all kid. Uncle John telling about it. That know-it-all, he never did get it all taken out of him. Their father died when my dad was just a little boy, so the only head of the family was Owen Eugene. The oldest son was the head man in those early families. Uncle Gene gave the orders. You asked him for permission. He made and settled the community deals. What he said went. John would not really question, but grouse a little. Grandmother always said, Owen will know what to do about it. With Aunt Liza and Dad, whatever Owen says is it. He was Owen at home, but Eugene almost every place else. Aunt Liza, we called her Bestas as little kids. She said Uncle Gene when she talked about him to us kids, but if we called him from the barn, she would call Owen. Up and down the valley he was Gene. I recall him as a stocky, robust man, gray hair, drooping white mustache, a little tobacco-stained. He kept steady company with a corncob pipe, used growler tobacco. Both smoked it and chewed it. Old Jim Riley, who helped out there sometimes, said of that tobacco, it is the vilest stuff that ever was made, ground alfalfa and thistles, and that pipe it would snuff out a forest fire. When we were little kids, the farm was all romp and play, but when I was about 15, I spent the summer on the farm to help with the farm work. I had fun. Dad thought it was a great place for a boy. That is where he grew up. I was big enough to help my uncles a little and learn about farm life. I was a husky kid and enjoyed it. Found some time to hunt woodchucks or play catch with the kids up or down the road. We had a pretty good swimming hole down the creek. My uncles had their separate responsibilities. John looked after the cattle and hogs. Uncle Gene looked after the horses and farm equipment. They gave each other a hand, but they ran their jobs like they were separate companies. I loved to hang around the horses. I helped John too, but milking I tried not to be good at. It is awful steady work. I would sometimes be up at Colley's and help Jerry milk, but down at the farm I wasn't considered a good hand at milking. I was happy to flunk the course. At this time they had 2 teams of horses. Uncle Gene drove one, and Riley, a hired man, drove one. They had a single buggy horse, old Maud. I drove Maud to the cheese factory with the milk. Some mornings my aunt or Anna Bly would go along and stop to see someone or get stuff at the Turtle Point store. Once a week the store had a wagon come out and deliver groceries and stuff, but we ran out of things and it was usual to bring back a pound of coffee or a can of baking powder. Mostly they bought by the 100 pounds, a barrel of flour. I had quite a lot of activities up and down the road. At the cheese factory, it took a long while to unload and load up our cans with whey for the pigs, and time for a bit of playing catch, a little tag, some wrestling. Some of the men would pit us kids against each other. I, being a town kid, had to do quite a bit of defending. Quite often had some cleaning up to do before I got home. My nose always bled, even when I didn't hit it. I never got hurt. My Aunt Bestis, a maiden lady, never understood why boys had to get so dirty. It was never real clear to my mother either. When I got back from the cheese factory and the detours, there was a little snack of cold milk and cookies. There were some jobs for Maud and company, like a little trash to haul out and burn, take tools up into the field for the men, haul seed, fertilizer, some wire for fence, and fence fixing equipment. There were still some rail fences on our farm. They were quite bedraggled, so they were reinforced with barbed wire. Some of the fencing was woven wire. Maud and I did most of the garden cultivating and shovel plowing. For cultivating the field corn and potatoes, they usually used one of the team horses. It was lead the horse up and down the row, try and keep them from stepping on the crop. Most of the neighbors did not shovel plow their rows, but not my uncle's. Then the potatoes had to be hand hoed and hand debugged, squash them with 2 pieces of shingle. I didn't know if there was spray stuff or not then. We had the pick and squash system. There usually were quite a few things for the one-horse shay to do. I particularly liked trips up or down the road to other farms, the necessary ones and particularly the unnecessary ones. Up the road there was the McNally boys and Jerry Colley. Down the road was Green's with a slew of kids. Finn's 2 big boys and the Sullivans. 4 miles down was the Cantwell farm. It was kind of hard to justify an errand down there, but Frank and Skip were my buddies. Uncle Gene sort of explained that we had some business here and other people had business there, and that was their business. We didn't want them to interfere with our business, etc. So after chores, I used to put a blanket and surcingle on Maud and canter away. Canter? With old Maud? With old Maud would hardly be it. Sometimes a little above a jog. Her old sway back was no rocking chair, and if she got much above a brisk walk, it was painful, for man and beast, and particularly a tender-bottomed boy. There was a McClellan saddle in the barn, but so old and dry, Maud's bare back was softer than that. I had a good time at work or play. It was hard to be sure which was which. Most everything was something new every day. It was a learning experience, but I didn't know it was. I began to learn about farm life, how to hoe a garden, fix fence, maintain a horse feed water brush and curry, shovel out the stall, tar soap the harness, treat sore fetlocks, clean and medicate their collar sores, fix pads to relieve pressure. Any work at the horse barn was fun. I helped out at the cow barn some, but that was chores. Uncle Gene would kiddingly say, "Would you like to go up and give the governor a hand?" meaning John. I would help feed and water the cows, carried up the milk that had to be strained, pails and cans cleaned up, chores. I liked Uncle John, but cows are for eating. When it rained, there was always a lot of lubricating jobs to do, wagons to grease, equipment to clean and oil up. It seemed like every day there was some grindstone work. Ours was a old hand turner. Sharpened tools, axes, scythes, mowing machines, sections, garden hose, sickles. Seems everything on the farm starts out with a trip on the grindstone. Keeping a steady turn on the grindstone is quite a discipline for a boy. Uncle Gene and I spent a lot of time at the grindstone. I learned how to draw a true edge on a blade, axe scythe, or whatever. Keep a good edge on a jackknife, not to leave a feathered edge which won't cut true. Even now I have no use for a dull tool. I got my instruction from a man who had only 2 terms in school, but I think he was the best teacher I ever had. He could put down facts with his finger on one knee. He could figure pretty near anything. He had such a keen memory, and he could tell stories about the old times that could put you right there in the midst of them. Electric grinders are efficient, and they can sharpen tools, but the old grindstone whetted both the tool and the mind. It exercised the wrist and the intellect. It triggers understanding like no flick of a switch can approach. We ground out stories about bad winters, floods, the sheep and cattle that died, people sick. The Indians came down the valley for food. They were starving. There were good Indians, and there were Shangos. Shangos eat anybody's chickens. The good Indians offer to help skidding logs, etc. You have to share what you can. That is the way it is out in the country. A Shango will never do you any good, but if you don't help him, he can do you more harm. I remember years later Uncle John telling about the Indian boys that were helping him. They are really pretty good boys for Shangos. I used to be fascinated when I could get Uncle Gene to tell about taking lumber and log rafts down the river. He went with his father, and then he became the boss's raftsman. He told that in the period after the Civil War, cash money was not available. Barter was the only trade. But when they sold timber down the river, they got cash. It was the only cash they ever saw, and no matter what the hardship, rafting brought cash money. In the winter, they got their logs down to the creeks and river, and when the ice went out, they floated their logs down to the river where they could be lashed together into rafts. People brought their logs and timber into rendezvous places. Uncle Gene shipped his own timber but acted as agent for other people. He bought and sold their goods. As they went down the river, they built up a bigger shipment. The Allegheny flows north, then turns and goes south, and this bend starts at Red House, New York, on the Seneca Indian Reservation. And this big bend is the Shallows, treacherous place to get through. They had to bring small rafts through here and then assemble them into big rafts. They would make a lot of trips around the bend, walk back and go again with another group of small rafts. There was an Indian at Red House that knew the channel, and he guided the operation. His name was King Jamerson. He and Uncle Gene became good friends. They visited each other back and forth. I met him one time at our farm. One time, Aunt Liza went down the river and stayed with the Jimersons until Uncle Gene came back. Once Uncle Gene took a raft to Cincinnati on the Ohio River. Ordinarily, they went to a mill near Pittsburgh on their regular trips. There was a big pond near this mill. It is where the Emward River and Allegheny joined to make the Ohio. This is where the timber was sold. They walked back home, about 150 miles uphill and down dale, sometimes through the woods. One time when Uncle Gene and Grandpa McCarey went down the river, and when they got near Pittsburgh, another raft group caught up with them and passed them the word that Grandmother was taken sick after Granddad's raft had left. So Granddad, Uncle Gene, and Bill Lundergan took out for home. They bought a jug of whiskey for a quarter, got some hardtack and some cracked corn, their only food. They walked all day and most all night, stayed one night at Clarion, Pennsylvania, and were home in 4 days. They would sit down and eat a bit, have a pull on the chug once in the afternoon, and go as long as they could see anything at night. Uncle Gene said that he walked for hours, almost sound asleep, leaning on the two men. He was a lad about 14 or 15. That's the good old days, pretty rugged, even terrible. This is the way they had to scratch for a living. They survived and were successful farmers, had good stock and raised fine crops. I remember Uncle Gene saying, "I've had a good life."